And so the oligopoly is basically, it's the fourth of the four market structures. So oligopoly can be very similar to monopolistic competition, where there essentially is brand versus brand competition, but and they compete against each other. But the big difference is the number of sellers. Okay, in oligopoly, you have a few sellers. If you remember your U.S. or your world history, and remember learning about Athens and Sparta, how Athens was a democracy and Sparta was an oligarchy. Remember the oligarchy was, a few rulers. They had, 2 people in charge and like a 30-person council, and, it was ruled by a few. Okay, that prefix oli means a few, and in this case, in an oligopoly, generally you have between 2 and 4 sellers, between them controlling the majority of the market. Okay, so you have few sellers, 2, 3, 4 firms control at least 55% of the market share. So, for example, the soda industry is a good example of an oligopoly where you've got Coke and Pepsi. And yes, you also have the Dr. Pepper company that makes a lot of the, the flavored sodas you see. Dr. Pepper is probably their best known, but they do A&W root beer and Sunkist and Big Red Cola and Canada Dry and 7-Up and RC Cola. They're not Coke and Pepsi, so they don't get the prime shelf space at the grocery store, but they're, those are kind of the 3 major players, and Coke and Pepsi clearly dominate. Dr. Pepper company is a clear third. And then there are other soda companies out there, but they really, don't have much market share. They are a very, very, very tiny player. So the soda industry is basically dominated by 3 firms. The comic book industry, you've got Marvel and DC. It's an oligopoly. You've got 2 firms that dominate it. The cell phone industry is basically an oligopoly of 3 firms, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. And it used to be 4, but T-Mobile and Sprint merged after the government kind of spiked a AT&T T-Mobile merger. The airline industry has 4 airlines, United, Delta, Southwest, and American, that control about 85% of the market. There are other airlines. There's Alaska Air, there's, Allegiant, there's JetBlue, there's some others, but they're very, very small players in the industry. So the key thing to understand with an oligopoly, okay, is that you have 2 to 4 firms, okay, generally selling differentiated products, okay, kind of like monopolistic competitions, brand versus brand competition. Now, they can, in theory, also produce identical products like in perfect competition, although, that's kind of more theoretical. We don't really see that. The key thing to understand with oligopolies is that they are mutually interdependent. So in a lot of ways, they act like monopolies, even though they're not monopolies. So, they're what we refer to as mutually interdependent. And so their products, they can be identical or they can be differentiated. They're usually differentiated. But the key thing to understand is that when one company acts, the others will follow. Okay. So if my company does something, what are the other ones going to do? Okay. They're going to do the same thing usually. And so we've seen that in the airline industry. When one company cuts rates, the other one also cuts rates. When one decided to start charging people extra for the aisle seat, guess what everybody else did? They started charging extra for the aisle seat. When one started, when one cell phone company kind of changed its pricing policies, the other ones changed their pricing policies too. So the reason why oligopolies form is because entry into the market is very difficult. It's what we call a high barrier to entry. It's very difficult for new firms to begin selling in that market because of what we call economies of scale. The companies that exist are so big and so efficient that a new firm is very difficult to join. A lot of times when we see antitrust action from the government where they, what we call the anti-monopoly laws, where they prevent businesses from merging because they're worried about, monopoly. They're really not trying to prevent monopolies. What they're trying to prevent is oligopolies. They're trying to prevent a situation where 2, 3, or 4 firms control the market, because when that happens, they do a lot of times kind of act like monopolies. And it looks like they're doing what we call colluding, which means that they're getting together and, setting prices or whatever. They're really not doing that. What they're doing instead is they're engaging in what we call game theory. They're making their decisions based on what they think everybody else is going to do. And they're going to make the decision that's not just best for them, but best for everybody. And so while it looks like they're keeping their prices high intentionally to put the screws to the customer, they're doing it because they don't want to start a price war, because price wars are really, really bad. And I've got a little simulation we can do that shows this. So in oligopoly, basically the way they compete is through non-price competition. They do use advertising just like a monopolistically competitive firm would. Generally, there is price leadership. There's a dominant firm that sets the price, and the other ones generally follow. Basically, everybody kind of takes their cues off of the dominant firm. So, and you can have more than one dominant firm. The dominant firm may be just the first one to act. Pepsi comes out with vanilla Pepsi, Coke's going to come out with vanilla Coke. It was actually the other way around. Coke came out with vanilla Coke first. The one thing we do occasionally see in oligopolies are what we call cartels, where firms will formally agree to coordinate their price and output. That is illegal in the United States, although it has not always been. In 1933, FDR, with the National Recovery Administration, not only authorized cartels, it basically authorized the government to force businesses to form them, to coordinate output and production. And the guise at that point was fair competition. In reality, the idea was, let's keep prices high so we can keep wages high, because that's something he was worried about during the Depression. In reality, the opposite was true. Prices needed to fall so that consumer activity could begin. Generally, cartels are bad for the consumer. Probably the best known cartel is OPEC, which is a cartel of Venezuela and most of the Middle Eastern countries that they kind of coordinate the production of oil to try to keep the price often higher, manipulate the price. And the United States and Canada are not members of OPEC. And so we can kind of foil their plans by, when they try to restrict the supply of oil to jack the price up, we'll increase our supply. And so that kind of foils it and brings everything back to the market. And a lot of times then what OPEC does to retaliate is they'll open the floodgates to push the price way down to punish us for doing so. And that's kind of sometimes how oligopolies work, where if one firm goes rogue and lowers its prices dramatically, for example, or increases supply dramatically to lower the price, the others will retaliate, often by doing the same thing. And that's what causes a price war. Understand that profit maximization in an oligopoly is just the same as it is in monopoly, just the same as it is in perfect competition, just the same as it is in monopolistic competition. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue, okay? That point where MR equals MC is the point where profit is maximized in an oligopoly. Unlike in monopolistic competition and perfect competition, in the long run, firms generally make a profit, which is probably, again, more like a monopoly. So to understand an oligopoly, you kind of have to understand game theory, okay, which is the idea that your decisions tend to be mirrored by others. And so therefore, you have to act not just based on what you think is best for you, but also based on how you think other people are going to react. And, we see this all the time in sports. I'm a big football fan. And the one thing I love about football is you see game theory every play. The offense is trying to trick the defense is trying to trick the offense, right? They don't want to reveal their hand, what they're going to do before the snap. And so a lot of times the offense will call a play based on what it thinks the defense is going to do, not necessarily what's the best play for the offense, but what's the best play for the offense based on what it thinks the defense is going to do, and vice versa. And I know like this Sunday, the Colts have 4th down on the 16-yard line. They need 1 yard. It's 4th and 1. They've got a pretty good running game. So what does everybody expect them to do on 4th and 1 is run the ball, right? And so they call a pass. And so generally that pass is a brilliant play call because everybody, including the opposing defense, is expecting you to run. The problem is that the other team had called a defense that was better against the pass. They sacked the quarterback or actually forced an incompletion. They got the ball back and the game was over at that point. You have to, if the Colts had the opportunity to go over that play again, they probably would have run the ball because the Ravens were in a pass defense. But they didn't. They made the wrong choice, and sometimes that happens. Sometimes you make the wrong choice. But you have to make your decisions based on what you think other people are going to do and how they're going to react. And so what you do then is you look for what's called the Nash Equilibrium. And in the Nash Equilibrium, that is what is best for all sides. Okay, and if you look, page 193 has a good example of this, where it kind of looks at kind of the payoff matrix, if you will, based on the profits for both, for two different options. And so here I've got kind of an example of that here. So here's our two companies, okay? And the way you read this is, notice company A is in the left, company B is on top. They can both advertise, and this explains also why you see political advertising, right? Because we know if we don't advertise, the other side's going to get all the airtime and probably all the votes, right? So we can advertise and we'll each make $100. If we don't advertise, we're going to make $0, and the company that does advertise is going to make $200. And the same thing, the company that advertises makes $200, the company that doesn't make $0. If we don't advertise, we make $0. So we know that the best strategy for both companies is to advertise, because they're both going to be better off if they advertise here. Okay? The company that doesn't advertise is going to make $0. The company that advertises is either going to make 100 or 200 based on what the other one does. So the best thing for both companies to do is advertise. And so you look for generally what's the best case scenario for both sides. And so because of game theory, what we need to do is that we have to make decisions understanding what other people are going to do. And so because of that, it appears that firms collude even when they don't, because the firms are mutually interdependent, because there's so few competitors. What one of them does, everybody else is going to follow. Okay. And so we kind of refer to this as the tit for tat strategy, where basically one firm will do what the other one did the last time. So for example, let's say we've got two firms and you can choose a high price or a low price. Okay. If we choose a high price, we'll both make a big profit. If we choose a low price, we both choose a low price, we're both going to make less profit. We're going to make a smaller profit. If one of us chooses the low and the other chooses the high, the company with the lowest price is going to make a huge profit. The company with the highest price is going to make the least. So what's going to happen is, let's say the first company chooses the low price to get the huge profit. Well, what's the other company going to do? They're also going to lower their price, and then eventually both sides lose. So it's better off for both sides to just keep the high price versus versus trying to compete. And so what often ends up happening is that that one firm often becomes a price leader, where they will they'll kind of carry out leadership, and then everybody else will follow. So so that's the basic idea behind game theory. I've also got a short video that's linked in the daily syllabus that you can look at.